Good morning. Here we are again to talk about performance in organizations. I am Kristen Kosinski. I am a coach and a consultant and started and ran a nonprofit organization that focused on international development work in northern Kenya. And I am here with Roger Addison and Klaus Wittkuhn, and they're going to introduce themselves, and we are going to begin our conversation. Roger, why don't you start?
Okay, I'll start. I'm Roger Addison. I'm here in Sausalito, California. It's kind of an overcast day, so it's kind of cool for us, which is nice. I've been in this business for over 40 years and doing consulting, both for profit and nonprofit organizations all over the world.
Excellent.
Okay, my name, you are ready, Roger, right?
Right.
You're done. Okay.
We are ready for you.
Because it was so ultra short, I thought maybe there's something more to come. Okay, so my name is Klaus Wittkuhn. Following Roger's example, I'm here in Bonn in Germany, probably easy to hear with a strong German accent. I'm a consultant also and have been working in industry, and 15 or 20 years ago, I started working in development work also, mostly for US aid in several sectors like education, healthcare, in energy. We did a number of projects all around the world. So we have some experience in development work, but still our foundations are in, let's say, normal consulting and business consulting.
Excellent. So we had a lot of great response from our vlog last week, and we have a few questions that I'd like to go over first, and then we're going to have a presentation. So I'm going to read the first comment question that we had that seems to be pertinent to this conversation. Thank you very much. What you say makes sense to me. I work as a consultant to primary schools from time to time, and I do many workshops to train teachers. Do you have other suggestions for me to help the proprietors be more successful with their schools beyond training the teachers?
That's always an interesting one about training the teachers. First, because it's another thing about, I think we mentioned last week, is that training is often the least thing we try to focus on. And so I would look at, and what we're going to talk about later, is looking at the organizational structure to make sure that is developed in order for performance improvement to take place. So if you don't have the structure, then it's very, very difficult to do an implementation of any type of performance improvement. And the other thing too is that I always found is that if you can have somebody in the organization to be a sponsor, that is very, very helpful. And so it's basically educating that person what they can expect out of your consulting work and getting them involved at an early stage. So that's what I found to be useful.
So basically you have one point person that really is managing the consultancy for the organization.
And one point person that's high enough in the organization that can make a difference.
Yeah, a decision maker.
A decision maker, right.
Yeah.
or a good decision influencer also. So somebody has some influence over the situation.
Can you explain that more a little bit about the decision influencer?
Well, there are people that are sometimes have been around for a long, long time in the organization, and they've got a pretty good network of people that they've worked with in the past. So if you can find somebody who is well respected, find somebody who has made a difference, and sometimes they've also show that they have interest in the organization itself. They may not be high up in the organization, but they just have, they sort of like, that's the person you go to for information about the organization itself. And so every organization has that. Who would I go to know more about? And then fill in the blank and say, oh yeah, I'll go over and see Liz. She knows about everything around here. So, I mean, that's the kinds of things that I've seen work for me.
Yeah. And every organization does have that person.
Right. I remember that was one of the things that I learned very, very quickly. If you can find those people, who do you go to for information? I was
Yeah.
doing a large project for the State Department, and one of the first things we did is that we were visiting embassies, and one of the first things we did is that who's got all the information around here, and it always was the basically the assistant to the embassy in some way.
Yes.
So
Yep.
it usually was a she. So if you can get in to find out who that she was, you learned a lot of information that you could basically leverage a lot along the way. So that was a lesson that I learned a long time ago.
Yes. I remember when I was at Paramount and network television, the assistant to the head of the president of our division
Right.
was that person.
Right.
Like she held the keys to the kingdom.
You know, and they're always there, and I always say that's the first one you want to make a really good friend out of. And so yes, the other one too. I remember I was working one project, and they had a big library, and I found out the librarians had lots of information about the organization because who was ordering what books.
Yes.
So it was a matter of you could leverage those, but they're all over the place. Yeah.
Klaus, do you have any follow-up on that? Or shall I? There's actually a part 2 of this question.
Yes, I mean, I have been carefully listening, and I thought this is an extremely difficult question because teachers certainly are important. So teacher training makes sense. Otherwise, it is so difficult to answer because all schools, if you look at different countries, schools are quite differently organized and face quite different challenges. In one country, I experienced even schools that worked in the morning with one group of people, one language, and in the afternoon, a different group with a different language. So you can see all kinds of challenges. But if you think of performance, the question would be, before you can answer the question correctly, the question would also be, what are you talking about? The performance of students or the performance of schools? This is not the same. It is connected, but it is not the same. And therefore, I do not feel to be in a good position, to give tips, because I do not know what kind of schools this person is talking about.
Right.
But you can be sure the performance of teachers, when you talk about teacher training, the performance of teachers also depends on how the school is organized, which means, are there clear objectives? Do they have ideas of what are the accomplishments we go for? Are there clear responsibilities? Is there anything like quality control and stuff like that?
Can you just talk for a moment? You just went into it a bit, but a bit more about the distinction between the performance of schools versus the performance of students?
Yes, a very simple one, which also illustrates an interesting aspect in the education sector, is you could say a performance of students. Let's do it a little oversimplified. You can look at the performance of students like this is finally their grades.
Right.
This is not, you can think differently also, but usually schools would think it's the grades of the students. This measures how students are performing. Now, if you look at the performance of schools, the stakeholders might have different perspectives. It's more like, we are not that much interested in measuring what individuals do, but if we look at the schools, we want to have something like a summary impression of how well does the school prepare the students for life after school, which means how many make it to university, how many make it into trade and get a decent job or stuff like that. Now, all those things are very interwoven. If you look at the UK, this is something one of Her Majesty's inspectors taught me during a project. In the UK, they do assessments of schools yearly, and they do rankings. And the inspectors are against those rankings because they say it basically doesn't tell you anything. If you want to become a top-ranked school, the best thing you can do is select your students carefully. If you have right students, even if you have mediocre teachers,
you get to be
they
a
will
top
take
ranked
care of
school.
themselves. And this is what the inspectors, this is what we see in private schools in London.
Yes.
They have incredible rankings and they have tough selection processes also. So maybe schools in districts where disadvantaged people live,
Yeah.
facing very difficult situations, do a much better job than those private schools, but they have no chance to get up in the rankings.
Right. It's like the private schools or certain schools have the luxury of selection.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting.
So in education, measuring this stuff is really difficult.
So there was a second part to this question. It says, I often struggle to convince schools that investing in consulting services can actually fetch more for them. Do you have any ideas to share for that?
Yes, but this is probably not
And
helpful.
I guess too, we can focus on, I know that was a good example talking about the UK, but also we're focusing a lot on schools in the developing world.
You know, from my experience, you know, working from an American viewpoint, I've got to have somebody in the country that is recognized as a consultant to work with me. So it's a matter of trying to show the value of performance improvement. I know I have a colleague in South Africa, and she and I work together a lot, but basically she's the point person in South Africa as opposed to myself. And I'm trying to collaborate with her on basically the issues around inclusion, the basics around diversity, basically all the issues that happen in those school districts or any other performance issues in organizations. So I mean, it's the idea of having somebody who is recognized as a good point person. At least that's what I found.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's that, you know, idea of having someone that's more at the grassroots as a partner.
Yeah, I'm a performance consultant tourist. Basically, I go there, but I leave. They basically
Right.
live in the country. They understand the culture that I don't, and the nuances of the
Right.
culture that I don't pick up. So if you can find somebody who understands that aspect, I think it just makes it more interesting, as well as if you understand it yourself and do a little cultural due diligence. I think that makes you more valuable as a performance consultant.
The thing is, when you look at this question, I mean, no consultant is a know-all. So it depends very much on what the consultant can do in an organization. And I think certainly, yes, in schools, if the consultant is good, you can see performance improvement of students. You know, they learn more. They are better in the subject matters. You can see improvements in the school as a whole. But then the management of the school or even the school system has to be willing to go with suggestions of the consultant, because whatever the consultant does, he will not beat the system. Like imagine, and this is what you experienced in some of your states also, come up with standardized tests, connect the salary of the teachers with how many of their students pass those tests. And what you are going to have in the end is a certain percentage of teachers tries to find workarounds and trick the system. And they go so far as teaching the students the questions of the tests in advance.
Been there.
You get cheating.
Been there. I was in Teach for America. I did that.
Okay. So this is,
I mean,
no
it
matter
wasn't based on my salary, but I remember teaching to the standardized test thinking, boy, this is really boring. What a horrible way to learn.
yeah. Now, then whatever the consultant might do, if the system is designed that way, teachers or school management will adapt to the system design.
Yeah.
And then if I don't have any influence on that as consultant.
So on some level, it's like the consultant is as strong as the organization's willingness
Right, yeah.
for change.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, I think, just in my opinion, as far as schools or any organization making the investment, the onus is really on the consultant to show, how they've allowed organizations to be successful. It's really on the consultant. On some level, so you need to have some wins for people to understand how, and maybe a lot of that is within the willingness of the organization, but you still have to show some wins, I think.
Yeah, you have to show your credibility
Yeah.
with the people you're working with. And so it takes some time to be able to do that. It's just, if you just go first in as a consultant, they don't know who you are, they don't know what you're there, and you're looked as an outsider. And if you can basically show that you have their best interest, and they're just trying to share information that will potentially, help them or drive them to better performance themselves as well as their students, I think that makes sense. And again, I don't want to be looked at as the outsider. I want to look at how do I become the insider. So I'm here to help.
Also, there's a great book by Patrick Lencioni called Getting Naked. Is that what it's called? Getting Naked? I think it is. Do you guys know that book?
I don't know that book. No.
Anyway, it's a great book on how to approach consulting and selling consulting services.
Right. Okay.
Getting Naked by Patrick Lencioni. It's excellent.
Okay.
And it's all about how do you serve people before you become their consultant. So one other question, and then we'll move on to the presentation. What are the preconditions for starting a transformation, really changing this performance and creating a transformation effort?
This is one that is easy to answer. I mean, the first and foremost one, I think, is you have to have serious buy-in of top management, because usually top management looks at itself as being the problem solver, like telling everybody else what to do, with or without the help of a consultant. This is not important. But they do not see themselves as being part of the problem. And if they are serious working with you, then there is an openness, and they consider, that some of the things they do might produce problems in the organization also. So you have to have this buy-in. If you don't, what I experienced in some projects is organizations sign MOUs, and the reason they signed it was, during the project, we will get 60 new laptops from USAID. And we will find ways to work around anything else.
Another workaround.
Yeah.
So it's like the leadership really has to own whatever their limitations are, where their stretches are, in order to make it work.
Yes, it's not that easy to check in advance, because there are high incentives working with USAID, from an organization's perspective in many cases. It's not that easy to check, but it's worthwhile.
That's the only way I've ever seen it work, is that you have to have, buy-in from the leadership. And it's just not, basically, it's just not, they got to show activity as part of the transformation. They can't sit on the sidelines. And so if they sit, on the sidelines and waiting for something to happen, I've never seen those projects are very successful personally.
They got to be willing to get their hands dirty.
Yeah, at least, show some interest at least. It's
Yeah.
like,
Okay. So for the sake of time, let's jump into the presentation.
Yes, we can. Let me quickly, I have to share my screen then, right?
right.
Now, you should see my screen saying how to engineer performance in any organization. And
Yes,
the
I can see it.
title is Performance of Organizations and Performance in Organizations. So when we started working on it, we did not know about the questions, but I think in a few minutes, it provides a nice framework around the questions we discussed today also. And there's an example in it that comes from education. So what you see here is, I think, a very basic idea to understand when you try to understand performance, and this is finally the foundation to design performance, is something like the bigger system defines the performance of the smaller system. Like the sector defines the performance, basically defines what performance is or should be in organizations in the sector. And here, this is a very simple graphic coming out of a project in an education system, like it was the ministry of the education system, like setting the goals for and then they had a body that developed all the curricula for the country, a small country, so it was one organization doing it. This organization provided the curricula and teacher training to schools and universities, and then they had an inspectorate that tried to inspect the quality of education. And what they did is they send inspection reports to the schools. Now, if you look at this, although some links are missing, you easily can see, you can think this like a circle, like you have a goal setting body, like planning, then you have others contributing to it, and then you have a body that checks. But if you think that way, then you could say, now, then there's something missing. And the two most important things missing in this project were the following ones. One thing is, the curriculum developing body was not connected with the inspectorate, which meant they came up with new curricula, trained the schools on those new curricula, and the inspectors went in and inspected on the old ones, which obviously does not make much sense. And the other thing is, the inspectorate did an annual report for the ministry, but the annual report was on what did we do during the year? Like we inspected 60 schools. The report was not on the state of the education system in the country. But if you think of the ministry setting the goals, this is what they need. This closes the loop. Like the ministry says, we want to achieve this. And then finally, the inspectorate would report on what has been achieved, what are the gaps left. So what do you have to do as a ministry? So they should have closed the loops. Now, only closing those two gaps, like connecting the curriculum development better with the inspectorate and making the inspectorate coming up with this state of education report, leads to considerable improvement in the whole system. And you hardly have touched any organization. You touch the inputs and outputs between them. And you haven't touched any school at all so far. But it will improve the schools also then, because things work together in a way that is more smoothly. So this is one, but this is just an illustration. If you think of scaling up and down, even if you look at sectors or whole education systems, it's always the same. Like the bigger system defines in a specific way what is the performance of the nested systems within. And this is true for any organization also. If you look at organizations, we showed this picture during our first presentation, and we said, yes, there are jobs where you find performers, then you have organizational units, you have processes, you have the whole organization, and you can think of those things, they are nested into each other. Jobs are nested in processes and in organizational units. Organizational units are nested in organizations. So it's like organizations somehow define what should be the performance of our processes and units. And processes and units define what should be the performance of our performers, of the people working in it. If you think agriculture, if you oversimplify it again, but if you want to ensure that a harvest goes to market within 3 days, everybody who works in this process, has been measured by those 3 days finally. So how fast has somebody to be in this process chain so that the whole chain finally can meet the 3 days? And the focus in organizations, when you think about organization performance, the focus in organization is very much on processes. And the reason for that is processes are where value creation happens. You take some input, raw material, know-how, whatever it is, you transform it in the organization, and this is always a process that usually goes across units. And then what you do is you produce some kind of output. This might be students, and your input is subject matter know-how and teachers and what you need to do this. It might be car as an output. It might be food as an output, no matter what it is. The thinking is always the same. But then you see, processes are where value creation happens. And therefore, if you want to understand performance in an organization, and this includes performance of people, you have to understand what is the performance of our processes. This is a graphic that I took from a friend of ours, Gary Rumler. He was one of the pioneers of thinking that way. So we do not have to go into the details. It's simply a generic graphic of showing how any organization is embedded in its environment and how those generic connections work. But what it shows, like, if you want to understand performance, understand how your organization is nested into a bigger system, and what are the incentives in the bigger system? How does the bigger system define what our performance is? And then you look into the organization with the same thinking, and then you end up looking at processes and how are people nested in processes, and you finally then can understand the performance of people. This is what we basically discussed in one way or another when we answered the questions also.
Yes.
We prepared this for this presentation because we thought this is kind of a cliffhanger to understand what we tried to show during the last 2 sessions, because the last 2 sessions focus on people again. But then we can take a different perspective and not only think of improving the performance of people is teach them something or work on their motivation. It might be in big organizations, this might take some effort. This is a photo of an organization that went through a considerable process, and they tried to understand their systems, their internal systems, and how they were nested and how they were connected with processes. You can see that this is a long, long wall and a lot of work going into it.
And actually, what this did is that this took, people started understanding what each business unit did. And so they understood that my output was your input. And they never had that picture before. People worked in silos. And this started breaking down the silo. And this picture turned the organization. This is what the organization looks like. It's an organizational chart, but actually it's a functional organizational chart, what actually people do. So they came up with this. I worked with them for one afternoon. We mapped out one business unit. We took it to the CEO. actually the commanding general. He looked at it. He said, "Oh, now I understand what you do." And he said, "How about doing that for the other parts of the organization and saying how we could all put it together so we understand each other's job?" So this is what it turned out to be, like 120 different silos working together.
Wow.
And just
So funny
mapping.
when you said that, I wrote down the word silo, and I think that happens so often in life, whether that's within an organization or the way that we just look at other people. You know, we have a tendency to look at other people and assume that everything's easier for them, or or they're not doing anything, or whatever that is.
And they came up with,
we really need to understand what our relationship is to other parts of organizations, to other people.
and they came up with this. I introduced the anatomy of performance to them, and then they came up with a modification that made sense for them, which is, fine, has the same elements. But again, the other idea, it shows, what each of those little boxes or each of those little pieces of paper shows the output to the next level. You go over to the next one. So it really was quite an amazing job. And you can see the guy at the other end. He's the one who started. All he did was facilitate each of the business units, and they did it themselves, which was another important thing. It wasn't him. It wasn't the consultant doing it. It was they did it themselves, each of the business units. So that was the other key to it.
It sounds like it speaks a lot to like interconnectivity.
Right.
Yes.
You could also see. So I mean, one of the things too, which was really interesting about, I know inclusion is part of the theme this year, and one of the things that they were working on a merger and acquisition of 3 organizations. And so they had to do something like this so they all understood what the job was. So they tried to include everybody in that whole process. And so it was a good value added by bringing on new organizations into this. So it's a good inclusion activity also.
Yes.
And inclusion.
Everyone gets included. Everyone gets to have a voice.
Right. Yes. Right.
In that. Well, I think that's a great place to end for today. Oh, so go ahead, Klaus.
Just one more remark, because what Roger just mentioned, I think inclusion is necessary. This is kind of a precondition of this work, because even in rather small organizations, you hardly find anyone who understands any given process in total.
Yes.
So
everyone needs to be represented.
Yes, you need the people working along it.
Yeah.
And then everybody has his or her own perspective of looking at things. And if you do not work in an inclusive way, you might miss out on quite important things.
Excellent.
It's not even the idea of being inclusive is enriching. It's much more substantial. You have to be inclusive because otherwise you are not going to understand it correctly.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end it today. Thank you so much. And we'll be back with more next week.
Thank you.
Make sure to leave questions and comments, and we will address them next week or the week after.
Great.
Thank you both.
Thank you.